Today we talk about the bucket of money dilemma.
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
I'm sure you're thinking right now, what is the bucket of money dilemma? And as you would expect, yes, I did make that up. But it is a real thing, and we're going to talk about it today and define it. See, not everyone is going to be fortunate enough to have fertility insurance. I didn't have it either. And you have to make a decision. Because just like not all of us have fertility insurance, most of us also don't have a bank account like Elon Musk. And since most of us are good citizens and we're not going to rob a bank, we all have a certain amount of money we can use to be able to get pregnant. And that is where I get the bucket of money. So the question then comes up is, what is the dilemma then? For some people, there will be no dilemma. If you go into your doctor and you find out you have severe sperm, then you may just say, okay, IVF is our only choice. But the question is it? What if seeing a urologist might be a possible choice? And therein lies the dilemma. Sometimes it's not just one treatment. Sometimes it's multiple treatments that you have to consider. And then you have to determine, if I start this treatment, am I going to still have enough money in my bucket to be able to do the next treatment if this treatment doesn't work? This scenario is exactly what happened with my wife and I. When we found out that I had severe sperm, we had to consider whether we see a urologist and undergo a procedure called a varicocele, or do we instead proceed with IVF? And we barely had enough money to even pay for IVF. So for us, we're like, listen, we don't want to pay for this procedure, and then if it doesn't improve the sperm and we still need IVF, now we don't have enough money to even do IVF. So let's talk about a couple scenarios where this can happen. One of the most common scenarios is doing artificial inseminations, IUIs, prior to doing IVF. As you know, we usually recommend doing up to 3 IUIs. If it hasn't worked, then moving on to IVF. And where this comes in, now if you have unexplained infertility, the chances of IUI working may not be great, especially if it's been many years since you've been trying and you haven't got pregnant. And so you may say, listen, I just want to try IUIs because they're low cost. But the question comes down to is that bucket. If that bucket's going to be used up for IUIs, then it's not worth doing, because if it fails, you can't do IVF then. But if that bucket's big enough, you can say, okay, I can try both. Now, for patients, let's say, who have like 5 years of trying, it might not even be worth trying the IUI first. It might make more sense going on to IVF right away. Other common examples are donor eggs. A lot of the times people want to use their own eggs. Makes a lot of sense. You're doing IVF, trying to get to that point where you have success, but you also know it may not work, especially if you're, let's say, 44, 45. And then the question is, listen, donor eggs are not cheap. And so, do you have enough money to be able to do both? And the answer for most of us is going to be no. And so again, that's that dilemma where you have to decide, does it make sense to do one, or does it make sense to do the other, since you can't do both? And I think this is something that's important when you're making decisions, because that's where you have to ask yourself, what's more important? Is it more important for me to have a child, or is it more important for me to have a child with my DNA? If your goal is to have a child, then it makes more sense to go with the donor eggs. If your goal is to have a child with your own DNA and you'd rather not use a donor, then it might be worth the risk. But the important part is that calculation needs to be in it. And doctors are usually not going to do that for you unless they think like me. This is a question I ask people because I realize that the goal for most of us is to have a baby. I mean, my wife and I, at any point where we're willing to adopt. And so you need to ask yourself these questions, because if you put everything into a treatment that's not going to work, you could end up being in a situation where when the treatment of choice is needed, you may not be able to afford it. I see this all the time with men who have low sperm counts and see urologists, and then they have these guys doing all this stuff. They spend thousands and thousands of dollars doing all these procedures, and then the guy still needs IVF, and now they can't do it because they spend so much money on doing the stuff with the urologist. That doesn't mean that's not a good option. Matter of fact, it's a great option for a lot of people. The question is, what if you run in that dilemma where if it doesn't work, like with my wife and I, then you can't do IVF? Matter of fact, years later, I actually did the procedure, which was a varicocele procedure, and it didn't help. The sperm was still bad, which means if we would have done it in the beginning, we would have then not had enough money to be able to proceed with IVF and basically would have never had my daughters. Now, this may make a lot of sense, but we don't think of it in those ways. And so when you're thinking of those things, it also comes to clinics. Now, this is not in any way to say clinics aren't worth what they're charging. Listen, different clinics do different things. Matter of fact, our clinic is a very affordable clinic. There are other clinics out there that are also affordable. But one of the things you have to ask yourself is that, is the clinic you're going to going to give you the best chance with your bucket? So let's say your bucket's really big, okay? Your dad ends up being Elon Musk, okay? And so you're like, hey, my bucket is endless. Go anywhere. Doesn't matter. They can even be a bad clinic, meaning low pregnancy rates. Eventually you're going to get there. Well, what if your bucket only lasts one time? Well, then it might actually make more sense sometimes to go to a place where you can do it 2 times. That will improve your chances. So if you're someone, let's say in their 40s, and we know that women in their 40s usually require about 2 IVFs to come away successful, if one clinic allows you to only do 1 IVF cycle with that bucket, but another clinic allows you to do 2 IVF cycles with that bucket, it might make more sense to go to the place with 2 cycles. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, what if they're not as good? Absolutely, that makes part of the decision. But let's say the good clinic is like 70%, and the other clinic is 50% live birth rate. Well, that seems simple, right? Go with the 70%, but that's actually not the right decision. If the one clinic is 70%, but the other one's 50, and you can do 50 twice, that's 75%. It's actually higher than the first clinic by doing it twice. And even more important is when you're older, sometimes it's not just about a good clinic. You can be the best clinic on earth. At the end of the day, once you start getting your 40s, it starts becoming a little bit more about chance, meaning statistically speaking, the best protocol in the world doesn't mean your eggs become better. It's more of a gamble. That month, do you make the good eggs? Are the eggs going to give you euploid embryos, or are they going to be aneuploid? And so if you're at that first clinic with those great rates, and you end up getting, let's say, some really good embryos, but they're all aneuploid, you're done. But you're at that clinic that ends up being a little bit lower cost, and you're able to go through twice, and maybe on the second cycle you finally get that euploid embryo, now you have the higher pregnancy rate. Now keep in mind, my point here is not just go find the lowest cost clinic, because it's not always going to be in your best interest. The point is, when you're deciding, this factor that we don't usually think of actually matters. And it goes a step further. For example, sometimes it might actually make more sense to do something of a lower quality treatment than doing IVF. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're someone who only makes 2 or 3 eggs, and you're 43. Well, we know at the age 43, you're going to need somewhere around 15, 20 eggs until you get a genetically normal egg in there, which means, that could take you 10 IVF cycles or maybe 8 IVF cycles. And if your bucket can carry that, hey, that's awesome. But if your bucket isn't enough to do that many cycles, it may not make sense to do that, because if you can only do 2 IVF cycles and you only get 6 eggs, statistically speaking, at 43, you're not going to get a normal embryo. So then what do you do? Well, one of the things you could do is you could say, well, what if I do 5 IUIs? If your tubes are open, sperm is, let's say, a little bit low, that might make more sense because if you do 5 IUIs with 2 or 3 eggs each time, that's 10 to 15 eggs. You increase your chances of statistically getting that normal egg. And you're able to do it within your bucket. Even further, there are things called like IVC, which is intravaginal culture, where you can actually go and get few eggs out of your body at a lower cost and then be able to make embryos. And so if your situation is a gamble situation, sometimes it actually makes more sense to do the lower technology treatment because you can do more of them, and that's the thing you need, quantity versus the quality. Everyone wants quality, don't get me wrong, but there are some people whose quality is really dependent on luck. And when it's dependent on luck, then quantity is really going to be the most important part. My goal for this podcast was not in any way to influence someone to pick a clinic or to pick a treatment based off of this bucket of money dilemma. My goal was to make sure you at least think about it, because sometimes we are so focused on our goals that we forget that sometimes the decisions we make may affect other things down the road. And so the importance here is that when you are going down a certain path, you need to ask yourself, does this give me the best chance? And the answer is no. And you know there's another treatment or something you can do up the road. You have to ask yourself, the question is, do I have enough money in this bucket to be able to do that next treatment? And so for you, balancing that is a decision that needs to be made. And unfortunately, not every doctor talks to patients about this. I do because it happened to me. And so I think about it for other patients. But like I said, you may be fortunate enough to not need this. You may have insurance, or again, you're related to Elon Musk. But if you're not, it's something to think about, and it's actually something fair to ask your doctor, and they're not going to mind it. You say to them, hey, I only have this much money, and my goal is this. What should I do? And they should be able to help you make that. And again, if you happen to be at a place that's a great place and you love your doctor, perfect, stay there. But my point is, if you're, let's say, choosing clinics and looking around, and you know you have that situation where one and done may not happen for you, you might want to keep that in mind when you're looking at those clinics, because if you're at a place that's very bad, it might take more than one cycle. And even if you're at some place that's good, it might take more than one cycle. And so we don't like to think of that bucket, but that bucket exists for some of us. And it's important to know when the dilemma comes up, what do you want to do? So that way you don't end up in the situation where you don't have any more money and you have to stop, when in reality, if you would have done the other treatment from the beginning, you probably would have had success. I'm so thankful every day that my wife and I chose to just go ahead with IVF, because if we would have done the varicosilectomy and didn't do the IVF, I honestly don't think I would have kids today, because after failing that, we probably would have just went on with adoption, because we wouldn't be able to keep affording to keep trying. And we'd have to wait years until we were older, that we had more funds to be able to try again. Here's praying that maybe you have insurance, or again, that you are related to Elon Musk. But if you're not, hopefully this podcast was helpful to you. Maybe you know someone going through it and maybe they're not thinking about these things. And so let them know about this podcast, and it might be able to help them when they're making those decisions. As always, I greatly appreciate everyone who comes and listens to this podcast. I always tell you, you're more than welcome to reach out to me on tbft@newdirectionfertility.com. More than happy to answer questions. I have lots of people send me questions about their IVF cycles, and if I have any recommendations, and I never mind doing it. We also have that other show called Sperm Meets Egg, which, by the way, we are doing a raffle to give away some stuff. So you might want to check that out at spermmeetsegg.com. As always, please tell everyone about us. Tell your friends about us. Give us a 5-star review if you love us. But most important, come back again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.